Good morning. This is session 7 of Between Paul and Jesus. And today we're going to be diving into the resurrection. And I am secretly or mischievously a little bit excited about today's session and possibly the next one as well. Although they could be considered quite controversial, I think, if you hold to the orthodox views. I think these views held here by James Tabor, they carry a lot of weight. They are highly plausible. And I think it is important that we from time to time just take a little bit at a view that might not be our own, and especially views by people who have spent the entire lives looking at these type of issues. So as you know, we're looking at the discrepancy between Paul and Jesus, or the early Jesus followers, which is our best link to Jesus. We're now going to be turning to a section on the resurrection. And this seems to be quite important to James because there's a lot of questions regarding the resurrection. I don't know if you've ever taken the time to watch some top-level debate, and I mean top-level debate, not low-hanging fruit, like me. But take some time, and there's some serious questions, things that need to be talked about and considered. And I must say that I think James Tabor offers, at this point in my journey, one of the most rational views, and also the one that more closely fits to the critical scholarship. So let me walk you through this slowly, and I'm going to do it slowly. I know these videos are not really for mass consumption. There's no sensationalism in them, and I just walk through things really slowly. So let me do that properly, at least for those of you who've been on this journey with us. We need to talk about Greek dualism very quickly, and then the ancient Hebrew view of death, because these are two major players in the way, or two major players that shape the way that Paul looks at and explains the resurrection. And once again, just so that you remember, Paul is the first person that writes about the resurrection, as far as we know, and in the extant textual history. So, number one, Greek dualism. The immortality of a soul presupposes a dualistic understanding of the human person, consisting of two separate components: the body, the material kind of body aspect, and then the soul/spirit type of component. The physical body is the house then of the true self, the inner spirit or soul. And this inner spirit or soul has always existed and cannot die and will always exist. So the death of a person was the end of not the person, but the body. At death, in the classical Greek view, the soul descends into Hades, right, the underworld, where it was judged, and then it was reborn. It goes through the river. This soul goes through the river of forgetfulness, as far as I remember, and then gets reborn into a new body, a kind of like reincarnation. As far as I know, the first Greek philosopher that speaks about reincarnation is our beloved Pythagoras. There are some suggestions, I guess legends, that he got these ideas from Eastern philosophy. We're not sure about that, but the point is that Plato, as far as I know, was a follower of Pythagoras in this idea. And so this kind of bled into the classical Greek view, that after death there's some process of coming back into life in a different body, but it's the same soul that's forgotten itself, right? So it was born into a new cycle of life, but ideally after some time, this soul would transcend into the higher celestial realms, and it would be free from the imperfections and the drawback of this physical world. The Platonic soul-body dualism became kind of like the standard belief in the Greco-Roman antiquity, even amongst Hellenized Jews. Hellenized Jews are those Jews who became Greek in their language, some of the culture, and in thought, philosophy, etc., because they were educated in it, right? Some of our most famous Hellenized Jews we know of is Philo, and from Alexandria, and of course Josephus. Both are contemporaries of the 1st century AD. Early Christian theologians later on, like Clement of Alexandria, Origen, and even Augustine of Hippo, They considered Plato to be a kind of a pre-Christian, and they reshaped their faith in Platonic categories. It's very well known, and you might even know this, that Christianity of 2nd, 3rd, 4th century are highly influenced by Greek thought. And the more you delve into this, the more I looked at myself and what I believed, I started realizing, oh wow, this is Greek. This is Platonic. This is Plato's ideas. This is Virgil, the poet. And in the first century, it seems like those ideas, the Greco-Roman ideas, and the more traditional Jewish ideas, apocalyptic Jewish ideas, were busy meshing, and they were conflating in some sense or another. And we'll have a look at that as we move on. For this reason, the Western spiritual tradition, Christianity included, of course, is shaped by Greek thought pattern even unto today. I was absolutely shocked when I started looking at ancient Greek philosophy and started reading its development, how much of the ideas I held as a Christian are really Greek. And very hard to find in the Jewish Old Testament. In other words, the point I'm trying to make is they're not really Jewish. They're rather more Greek, and that it seems like Christianity is a mesh-up of Jewish and Greek philosophy. All right. So we hold a lot of these ideas today. For instance, the body perishes and the immortal soul passes unto the unseen realm of the spirit. This is the traditional you go to heaven when you die type of scenario. It's very, very Greek. Now, in contrast, the ancient Hebrew view of death was slightly different. The Jewish concept of resurrection is in contrast, and it was shaped around the importance of the body. Right? The body was incredibly important to those who believed in the Jewish end of the day, end of the world, end of time type of resurrection. The dead would live again at the end of days. They were going to literally, physically rise from their graves in newly created bodies. Man came from dust, but was breathed into by God, and so became a breathing creature. Unfortunately, in our English Bibles, this breathing creature, which is the same word used for humans and animals, by the way, is translated as living soul. And this is a little slightly misleading. When a human dies, in the ancient Hebrew ideas, the breath leaves him, it leaves the body, and the body returns down back to dust. From dust you came, to dust you return, are the things we say at funerals. This we can see in Genesis 2:7, 1:24, 7:15, 3:19, Numbers 9:7, Ecclesiastes 3:19 to 20. Greeks and Jews had a view of an underworld called Sheol in Hebrew, but it was primarily a metaphor for the grave or the pit. If you go and read all the occurrences in the Hebrew Bible, it's largely used as a metaphor for your grave, basically. Right? Psalm 33, 115, 17, 6, 5, 80, 3 to 12, 88, 3 to 12, Isaiah 38, 18, Job 3, 9, 11 to 19. The dead in Sheol are kind of like shadows of their former selves. They're not really alive. And we find this in Job 14, 10 to 12. Nothing is ever, and this really struck me as strange when I was looking at this, that nothing in the ancient Hebrew scriptures is ever said of a blessed or a vital afterlife or a soul going back to God in heaven. Although this is an absolutely critical Christian idea, it is not ancient Hebrew idea at all. You will never find the idea of people going to heaven in ancient Hebrew scriptures. And that is interesting, right? It should be in there according to what we think, we do think about the coherency or the univocality of the biblical scriptures. But the notion of resurrection, of course, also is not really found in the ancient Hebrew scriptures, but it's something that developed in the Jewish thought. And we call this apocalyptic thought. And it was during the time under the vassalship of the Persian Empire that the Jews started thinking in terms of a final resurrection. Most scholars believe that this was in response to strong monotheistic thrusts in the Second Temple period. And it was fueled by questions about justice, about this life, and the suffering of just people within this life. Of course, we can't leave out that during this period, the Persian Empire, its official religion was Zoroastrianism, which has as one of its core tenets a lot of what we see today in Jewish apocalyptic thought, which is the resurrection of the dead, saviors, etc., etc., etc. I won't go into that. That's the Zoroastrian belief. So, the idea of a final resurrection is also not ancient to the Hebrews, but becomes more prevalent in the Second Temple period. Second Temple period is basically from the let me get this right, 5th century forward, I think. All right, so we consider the BC. We consider two versions of resurrection that we find in the Bible. The first one is just the resuscitation of a corpse. We find that a couple of times. Best biblical example, of course, or well known, is Lazarus. He dies, he gets resurrected. He just literally stands up, gets out of the grave, walks around. He's still the same person, and he still dies in the end. Right? That's just what we call resuscitation of a corpse. The other one is different. It's at the end of time. It's a general resurrection. And this is where people from Sheol comes forth with newly formed bodies. And these newly formed bodies are in an immortal form. In other words, once you get resurrected in that way at the end of time, you can never die again. The only ambiguous reference to this kind of resurrection in the entire Hebrew Bible is found in the apocalyptic book of Daniel, which we understand to be from the 2nd century. So it's a very late development. The reality, though, is that New Testament Pharisees, the first of the 1st century, including in Paul, Jesus, and his followers, they were apocalyptic Jews, and so the resurrection was absolutely central to their belief of what was going to happen at the end. Resurrection in the Greek literally means to stand up. But in the case of the final resurrection of the dead, it's more a transformation than a resuscitation, because the body becomes immortal, right? So something has to happen to the body. The Sadducees was a Jewish sect, as you know, and they did not believe in this type of resurrection. In the end, they opposed all apocalyptic writing, and they strictly held to the Torah or the ancient Jewish beliefs. Therefore, that was completely outside of their peripheral. But the Essenes, Pharisees, Jesus, and Paul seems to hold strongly to the idea of a general final resurrection of the dead. For Jesus, the resurrection, the only real reference we have of Jesus for the resurrection, is that it's some transformation into a higher order of life, like the angels, that no longer differentiates between male and female. And we find this in Mark 12:24 and Luke 20:34. For the Jews, this never meant a disembodied afterlife. And this is pretty important. This is where Hebrew afterlife differs from the Greek afterlife. There's no disembodiment for the Jews. You remain dead until you're resurrected and you get your old body back transformed. It's a re-embodied afterlife. For Plato, then, in essence, death was a friend because it was a freeing from the prison of illusion. But for the Jews, it was an enemy, and this enemy would reign until the resurrection. So, now that we know in a very, very short, you could literally do session upon session about the development of these ideas. I think I've done some of it in my discussions on the evolution of Satan, but this is a very short version of the main differences between Greek and Jewish thought of the time. Now let's return to Paul. Paul's view on the resurrection seems to make use of Greek dualism's language, but maintains a clear distinction between Greek immortality of the soul and the Jewish resurrection of the dead. And this is where Paul is clever, because he packages Jewish ideas in Greek language, and it's clever because he's writing in Greek to mostly Greek people, of course, of which many were possibly Jews, but many also were just pagans, as we would say. He maintains that one who is dead is naked. This is Paul's idea of what it means to be dead. When you're dead, you're naked. Now, naked is bad, right? So you need to be reclothed. And what you will be reclothed with, though, is a spiritual body. Now, we're going to be talking about this in detail, but there's two things we learn from Paul, and this is kind of a synopsis to start off with in some sense. The first one is that Paul has no interest in the naked soul of Plato, right? Plato's naked soul goes up eventually and spends his time with the gods or with God or the one. For Paul, this is a transition. Nakedness is not a good state. You have to be reclothed. So Paul has not really an interest in the naked state of Plato's soul. But Paul also has no concern for a physical resurrection body. And this is absolutely crucial. And I'm going to take my time to bring this home properly. This is probably the most interesting talk I've ever heard on the resurrection. And to some degrees, it's convinced me. Some of it, not so much, but some of it, yes. The point here is that James Tabor maintains that Paul had he did not regard the resurrection to be bodily. Now, I know as an Orthodox Christian, this is against what you should believe, because the later accounts of the Gospels seem to re-emphasize or emphasize and continue to do a physical, bodily resurrection of Jesus. In other words, Jesus walked around in his body, just transformed in some sense. But it does seem, and we're going to be taking our time slowly through this, that Paul has no regard for the physical body after resurrection. In 1 Corinthians 15, Paul states, he says that those who are dead will be raised when Jesus returns. This is that final general resurrection. But some there in Corinthians, they didn't believe in the resurrection of the dead. Now, this could be because of the influence of the Sadducees, but also very likely could be because resurrection for Greek Hellenized peoples was absolutely absurd. What happens if a lion ate you? What happens if you died at sea? How's your body going to come up out of the grave? How's it going to be put together again once all the enzymes has deconstructed it completely and it ended up in the dung of a lion? I mean, how does this actually work? So it was an absurd idea for the Greeks. There were some in Corinthian church that didn't believe in this idea, of course. Why would they be, if they were Greek and thought, the Christians, why would they want to be imprisoned again within the body? If the dead are resurrected, then the question is, with what body do they come? And so this is a central issue for Paul. And I never gave it much thought why this is an issue, but now I think I'm starting to realize why this is actually an issue for Paul. What type of body we are actually talking about? Are we talking about the actual body of that person physically up and walking around again, but just immortal? Or are we actually talking about a completely different type of body? And so it seems clear that Paul is talking about a different type of body. He's talking about what he calls a spirit body, a wind body, a breath body. And he uses Jesus as an example, in some sense, as a forerunner of what's also going to happen to us. So there's a very strong link between what happened to Jesus and what's going to happen in the general resurrection. In fact, probably for Paul, the fact that Jesus resurrects is the ticker. It's the time stamp showing that the time is close for the general resurrection. Well, Paul then says that in the same way that Jesus was resurrected, and we'll talk about that, so we will also be transformed when he comes. So in Paul's view there, when Jesus comes, which he believed was imminent, that those who are alive would immediately just poof, in the twinkling of an eye, there's a transformation that takes place to them, in them or with them. And those who are dead, of course, they also rise in this transformed new state. But here's Paul's argument. James lays it out in 5 little steps here, and I think it makes a lot of sense. Number one, if there is a physical body, there's also a spiritual body. He uses lots of examples. You can go read it in 1 Corinthians 15, I think. The first Adam came as a living being. Living being here, it's Greek, so it won't. Apologies. The last Adam became a life-giving spirit. He continuously contrasts these two. He says, first is the physical, then is the spiritual. The first man was from earth, a man of dust. The second man is from heaven. And lastly, number 5, just as we have borne the image of the man of dust, physical flesh and blood, We will bear the image of the man of heaven, which is this new form of being. Then there's a verse that James Tabor harbors on a lot. And it's one that's bothered me for a very, very long time. And I feel like this explanation kind of puts it into perspective. And it's in 1 Corinthians 15, verse 50. So it's towards the end of the argument. Paul says, flesh and blood cannot inherit the kingdom of God, nor does perishable inherit the imperishable. And so this is a real issue. It was a real issue for me in my former years because we believed that Jesus was physically resurrected, like in his body, like a flesh and blood type of body. And he has that body somewhere, wherever we thought he was, he's got that body up there. But this is a real problem because Paul says that this type of body, it just can't get into the kingdom. So what can, really is the question then. All right. Paul sees Jesus' resurrection as the proof that this new process of transformation of physical beings into a higher spiritual being is actually underway. It's one of the things that we picked up on during a couple of previous sessions, that where Paul differs a lot from the early Jewish followers, is they were very earthly in their thought. Bodies were earthly, the kingdom on earth, and physical, immortal bodies. But Paul is more cosmic in his thinking. Paul seems to emphasize that there's like a race of sons of God, celestial type of beings that's going to rule over everything else. So let's talk a little bit more about this body in question, because it's a central issue to the resurrection and the kind of resurrection we are talking about. Because the kind of resurrection that we talk about in Jesus is also the kind of resurrection, according to Paul, that humans themselves will then finally experience, right? So Paul's understanding of Jesus' resurrection being, and we're assuming here that we're going with James Tabor on this, that's actually a spiritual resurrection of a spiritual transformed being, not a bodily resurrection of flesh and blood standing up and walking around. If we consider this, and it's new, it was quite new to me the first time I engaged it, and I'm assuming that many of you, those of you who do follow this, probably this is new to you as well. It allows us to relook how we understand Jesus' resurrection, and what happens to his body after it's taken down from the cross. Now, Paul starts in 1 Corinthians 15, verse 3 to 4, with a formula-like recitation of what he calls the gospel. Let me quote it to you. For I delivered to you as of first importance that which I also received. Christ died for our sins in accordance with the scriptures. He was buried, and he was raised on the third day in accordance with the scriptures. Now, this is 25 years after Jesus. Now, remember also that Paul was not a witness to any of this, right? Most scholars believe that here Paul is passing on an early creed from Jerusalem apostles or the early church of Antioch. In other words, it's something he got from them. Now, he sat with Peter, and Peter told him this, and so he's now just repeating it as he's writing to the Corinthians. This obviously seems possible, but it's not certain. And here, I think, is where James Tabor differs the most in terms of his resurrection view from other scholars. He says this is not certain. And the reason he says this is because Paul insists that he did not get his gospel from people. It did not get to him by people, through people, from people. He got it straight from Jesus by the revelations, these visionary experience that he had. Galatians 1 verse 11 to 12 makes this pretty clear. Earlier in 1 Corinthians, he also writes about the Passover or the Last Supper tradition. He says that I write which I received from the Lord. In other words, even the Passover tradition, or that which, how we understand the Last Supper, or at least how Paul puts it forward, he says he got it from Jesus, right? Now, he never knew the earthly Jesus, so it had to be through these revelatory, visionary experiences that he received this information. And James makes the parallel here. He says, why can't he have received the ideas on the resurrection also through the same way? He received it. He doesn't say he received it from people. And in addition to that, he insists in other places that he did not receive it from people. He got it directly from Jesus. And even something as big as the Last Supper, he also insists that he received it from Jesus, the Lord. And so James makes the point. He says, guys, what if this tradition about the fact that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the scriptures, that he was buried and raised on the third day, actually comes from Paul once again, just like the Last Supper. That just doesn't mean that there was nobody before Paul. It just means that Paul kind of has his own lane that he's running in parallel to what possibly some of the early Jewish followers of Jesus would have had. Either way, Paul tells us what he now believes. First, we can conclude that the Jesus he claims to have seen is not physical. He's not a physical resurrected corpse. And this is important. And I think a lot of people, the average Christian would obviously not agree with this because they see the New Testament as univocal. But it seems quite clear to me that Paul never insists on a physical Jesus anyway. In fact, he believes flesh and blood can't inherit the kingdom of God. And he has some visionary, spiritual / celestial type of experience. Secondly, he equates these experiences with those who went before him. In other words, we could say that in Paul's view, he believes that everybody, now this is controversial, that everybody had the type of experience he had. Right? Paul's the first to write, this is the first mention of resurrection that we have. Now I know as a Christian, your mind goes back to Matthew, back to Luke, back to Mark, back to John. But these people are writing way later than Paul. So really, if we're reading it in historical chronology, we are talking about Paul, the first one, writing about the resurrection and equating kind of his experience with those who went before him. In other words, you could make the case, or you could say that it is plausible that his experience is explained to be spiritual, visionary, whatever you want to call it, but that he assumed that everybody's was like that as well. So this is quite interesting. He equates his experience with those who went before him. We can assume, at least in Paul's view, that their experiences were also this type of experience. They all saw Jesus in this new, transformed, glorified type spiritual body. Thus, it could be argued that Paul, having no regard for the passing of any, having no regard for the passing away of the natural, physical body, could have believed or understood that Jesus' physical body returned to dust. So here's the real kicker of all of this, and this is probably the most succinct way of saying it. There is a possibility that Paul believed that Jesus' body returned to dust, and that his resurrection was his true self, spirit, soul, whatever you call it, being transformed into something brand new. Right? This goes against orthodoxy, of course. All right, let's work with this a little bit longer. And that he was clothed with a new spiritual body. The physical body had nothing to do with the new spiritual body. Now, this is the thing that is a bit hard to first get your mind around, but there's a possibility that Paul understood this resurrection as a complete new spiritual body, and not the God taking the atoms in the old body and making them a new type of atom in the new body. No. The body dies, and the spirit becomes transformed into some heavenly form of whatever. Right, okay. So please, let me just at this point say, the things that I'm saying are not necessarily things that I believe to be 100% true. I'm holding in tension or in suspension the ideas of another author, and I'm trying to explain them. So please don't get offended by them. You have to be able to hold somebody else's or contrary views in suspension. Look at them from all angles at least before you just chuck them out. Otherwise, you have no possibility of ever growing or changing your mind. Okay, the point is then that the physical body, possibly for Paul, had nothing to do with the new spiritual body. Paul believes in a bodily resurrection, but can be understood more accurately as an embodied resurrection or a transformation. A bodily resurrection is one thing, but a resurrection in the same body is something completely different. And I think James is making the case that Paul possibly did not believe in the resurrection in the same body. He believed in a resurrection in a brand new spiritual body. Okay, hold that thought. Um, Consider someone who was eaten by a lion, for instance. How would they be resurrected in the physical bodies, in his physical body? This notion was completely absurd to the Greeks, of course, but Paul's brilliance here actually counters that problem completely. If you think about what Paul is doing, is he is talking about bodily resurrection, which the Jews are happy with, but he's at the same time he's saying it's not the actual body; it's a different type of body, and possibly the Greeks could have absorbed that a little bit better. Resurrection is therefore then not the transformation of the physical into the spiritual. Resurrection is the reclothing of the essential naked self with an altogether new spiritual, heavenly, celestial, immortal body that frees it from the Hadean state. So, an example from the New Testament here could possibly be when Herod thought that Jesus was John the Baptist that was raised from the dead, without going and checking John the Baptist's grave for his actual body. Now, these are small little indicators that they could have existed at that time, the type of idea somewhere that Jews weren't, that resurrection not necessarily meant that you use the same body. Okay. Leaving for a moment aside the later empty tomb reports. Of course, now we go to, of course, your mind is already there if you've read the Bible enough. What about the empty tomb? So we are heading for the empty tomb. It is absolutely critical in all of this. And we're going to do a critical reading of the Gospels together with Paul this time, understanding the importance of Paul in this whole story. What do we make then of the empty tomb reports? We have to take Paul seriously as the first witness to the resurrection, and we could possibly end up with a completely different view of the resurrection. Flesh and blood cannot inherit the kingdom of God. I want to end now this session with an example that he gives of a first century text that gives us some indication that there might have been some Jews that possibly believed in this type of thing. Now, this is it's titled the Gabriel Revelation. It's a text. It's dated to the end of the first century. It purports to be a revelation of the angel Gabriel about the final battle between good and evil, apocalyptic in its view. Of course, the resurrection is going to feature in something like that. The final portion focuses on the death and the resurrection of a messianic leader. It's not Jesus, by the way. It's possibly Simon of Perea, who led a revolt in 4 BCE. He was captured and he was beheaded in Transjordan by Herod's military commander Gratus. His body, I quote, becomes dung of the rocky crevices. That's a quote. But yet, even with this in mind, Gabriel addresses him and says, I command you, Prince of Princes, in 3 days you will live. All right, so there's a couple of things here. Number one is the idea of death and resurrection in 3 days. But there's something else that lurks in the background. This guy's body is already integrated into the ground. It's become dust, yet there's a resurrection. So what does that mean for us? Now, since Paul is our earliest source on the resurrection, and he also speaks of Jesus being raised on the third day, we have to ask the question at least, might Paul have had access or knowledge of this account, and whether he based Jesus' resurrection slightly on this? Nevertheless, the body of Simon that had already become dung in the desert wasteland was resurrected. All right, we're following the story here. It provides us with valuable evidence about how the concept of resurrection of the dead could have been understood between some Jewish messianic groups of the time. Please understand, as far as I can see, that, like with any type of religion, it wasn't just wasn't just is monolithic the right word? It wasn't just everybody believed exactly the same thing. There were many multiple streams with different ideas, and Paul is one of these guys who has really, really different ideas. But might there have been another group that had some similar views? It becomes more likely that Paul could have had the same idea of Jesus' resurrection. The body goes to dust, but the spirit/soul is reclothed in a brand new spiritual body. Why is this important? Well, that would mean that we didn't need Jesus' physical body for the resurrection, and that it could very well have meant that his physical body returned to dust in a grave. But why and how do we make sense of the empty tomb? We'll have a look at that in our next session, and I'll see you next time. Thanks.